analyst Ross Feingold is joining us from Taipei to discuss the latest developments underway in South Korea. Ross, thank you so much for joining us here on A News from all the way Taiwan, Taipei. Let's talk about what is going on in South Korea. Last night was quite important for Koreans. What is the historical significance of President Yoon martial law declaration given South Korea's traumatic history with authoritarianism, particularly under leaders like Park Chung-hee and Chung Do-won? How might this decision reshape the public trust in democratic institutions in a country where democracy was hard-won only in the late 1980s?
Most likely, it's going to cause the people of South Korea to value their democracy and safeguarding democratic institutions and safeguarding the public's right to participate in public policy making. It's going to increase people's appreciation for what they have built over the past 40 years since South Korea democratized after, as you said, it was previously ruled by military strongmen. That was most of the post-World War II period during the Cold War. And the United States supported those leaders, but South Korea eventually democratized. And I think by going to the streets very quickly, the people showed that they don't fear the military or the police, even in a martial law situation. And they were willing to do what's necessary to safeguard their democracy, as were those members of the National Assembly who snuck into the assembly. They went around or past the assembled soldiers and police, and they voted to turn down, to refuse to uphold this martial law declaration from President Yoon.
Well, we are talking about a South Korea that is quite economically right now, and the entertainment business quite high. But in reality, we've seen South Korea in a way that in Ganju uprising. We remember the Ganju uprising happened in like 1979, if I'm not mistaken. When we talk about all of this, South Korea is quite interesting, actually. The way that it rose up from its ashes and created a country that is high on the economy, high on the entertainment, high on the technology as well. But right now, something like this happens, and we know that Yeol is a leader that is quite right-winged. And it was when he was being compared with Moon Jae-in, we were talking about his presence a lot. So given all of this, do you think that this is a step back for South Korea, or are they going to be able to rise from this short-lived martial law thing and go on as they are?
I think the initial response that we saw from the public, the media, as well as members of the National Assembly, is that they are ready to rise above this. This was a somewhat bizarre declaration by President Yoon. He has the right to do it, but the circumstances really didn't require him to do it. And he seems to have done this more out of saving his own role, given the corruption investigations that are swirling around him, including with regard to his wife. So it seemed like he wanted to protect himself more than to protect the institutions of South Korean democracy. And again, it's clear that the people and the members of the National Assembly from different political parties, from the opposition, as well as from the conservative right-of-center party of President Yoon, were willing to reject what he declared. And even though the people of South Korea know that they are, as you said, in a geopolitical hotspot, they have the potential for war with North Korea at any time. But when it comes to safeguarding their democratic institutions, they were willing to do what's necessary. So I think South Korea will rise above this incident. It will certainly be a historic moment in South Korea's politics and in its history. But I think South Korea is going to move on from this and prosper, whether that's economically, you mentioned its entertainment industry, and as a place in East Asia that actually is known for democracy in the 21st century and is no longer known for totalitarian leadership.
Well, given that Yoon's approval ratings have been battered by corruption, let's talk about it as well. Corruption scandals involving himself and his wife, including allegations of influence peddling. How significant is the impact of these scandals on his ability to govern effectively? Are they likely to play a decisive role in his potential impeachment?
Yes, it seems likely that there will be enough support in the National Assembly to impeach him. And then it will go to South Korea's constitutional court for a ruling. If it's a positive ruling, then he will be removed from his job. He still has over 2 years left in his term. But he seems to have offended so many people, the public, as well as in the National Assembly, including his own party. It's still early in this process, but it does seem likely that there will be an impeachment motion in the National Assembly and that they're going to get the 2/3 vote to temporarily remove him from office pending adjudication at the Constitutional Court. So he may have written his own death warrant as far as being the president, but we'll have to see what happens in the coming days, whether or not the opposition does bring forward this impeachment motion and whether or not they get the 2/3 to approve it.
Ross, do you happen to have any knowledge about the South Korean media and what they're talking about right now? Because we have what I've been going through, that before this, when the corruption starts, South Korea has the tendency to cover the media, cover it up with different kind of entertainment business kind of scandals, just to be able to make sure that they have a black sheep there and they are attacking the entertainment names so they do not come up to politicians who are being corrupt like this directly. Does it still continue? Do you have any knowledge about the media?
Well, like other countries here in East Asia, there's media that is pro to the left or pro to the right. And depending on who's in power, there's going to be some media that have close relationships with who's holding the presidency of South Korea at any given time. But one of the very interesting things about the media last night, about almost 24 hours ago when this was announced, is the media continued to broadcast. And even though the military issued their very first martial law order saying that the media was going to come under control of the government, it was basically ignored by the media. And the media continued to have their live stream. They had press on the ground outside the National Assembly, or I should say they had reporters and camera persons on the ground outside the National Assembly. They had studio analysts continuing to discuss the developing situation. And again, they basically ignored the order from the military. They just didn't take it seriously that the military would try to restrict the press's ability to report.
Well, let's talk about the South Korean military as well, because the military has historically been a key player in coups and authoritarian regimes, which instances such like I was talking about the Ganju massacre in 1980s. What role should the military play in the country's democracy today, and how should its actions during this crisis be evaluated?
The important principle here, and this is something that it took a long time for South Korea to achieve, also here in Taiwan, where I'm speaking from, it also took a long time to achieve as well, and this is civilian control of the military. It's such a key part of a mature democratic society that the generals have to understand that they are not in charge, and it's the democratically elected leaders who are in charge. And in most democracies where there's an executive branch, a legislative branch, and a judicial branch, the military has to understand that it answers to those other branches of government, and they are not in charge. And we saw last night that the military actually followed the orders initially of the elected president, but then they withdrew just as quickly as the National Assembly and then the president and the cabinet said that we're canceling this martial law. So hopefully over the medium to long term, this will be a lesson for the South Korean military that ultimately they are not in charge and it's the civilian elected leaders who are in charge.
Well, the militaries, as you mentioned, it is quite important that we have seen the footage and they were actually turning the military down by standing up to them and the people of South Korea. We are talking about young people and we are talking about a generation that hasn't seen a coup attempt or a military action or a martial law yet, but they have heard it from their elderly because pretty much right now, I've seen an analysis, and it's quite important to highlight that everyone in South Korea, every generation in South Korea right now has seen a coup attempt or martial law as something like this. They have seen, all of them, all of the living has seen it right now, they say. So when we think about it like that, there have two different situations. We have young people walking to the military saying that they are not going to be able to do this. And we have elderly people trying to stop the military to enter to the parliament. These were the two distinct footages that I have seen last night. And how would you evaluate the reflection of this to the military in the South Korea of a country who has a soldier, every man has to have their military service for 2 years because they are still, quote unquote, at war with North Korea. So do you think that are those dynamics going to change, and probably young people are going to be like, I do not want to be a part of this. I do not want to spare 2 years of my life for this because I do not believe in the martial law. Do you think that this kind of uprisings may happen in the future of South Korea?
You mentioned one of the important dynamics here, which is that most of the soldiers in the military are young men doing their mandatory 2-year service. So it's pretty unlikely that they would have fired on their contemporaries. As you mentioned, there were young people. There were also older people who were protesting outside the National Assembly. But again, the idea that young men who could just as easily be protesting would fire on their contemporaries does seem really unlikely, and that probably also accelerated the collapse of the martial law. It might very well be the case that the military will be damaged as an institution. It will have some reputational damage because it initially did follow the orders of the president. But again, that's why I mentioned and emphasized why it's so important that the military understands that there's civilian control and that it's not up to the generals to decide the political direction of the country. It's up to the elected leaders and the elected legislators. But the threat from North Korea does not go away. And that's something that South Korea's society, including the military, including the politicians, they're also going to have to deal with in the aftermath of this failed martial law attempt, that they still need to maintain their military capability to fight back against any craziness that comes from North Korea.
And how might Yoon's actions influence South Korea's relationship with key allies, including the United States and Japan, who have often emphasized the importance of democratic stability in the region? Could this crisis affect cooperation on shared security issues like North Korea's nuclear threat?
Well, certainly one of the highlights of President Biden's foreign policy was his ability to bring Japan, Korea, and the United States into a closer security relationship. So President Biden does deserve some credit for that. I mean, he was helped by the fact that a right-of-center President Yoon was willing to do that with the Japanese leadership. And even though Japan has changed prime ministers multiple times in the past 4 years, President Biden was able to persuade Korea and Japan to draw together closer because they do have joint security or common security concerns with China, as well as obviously North Korea. It's a bit difficult to answer your question, though, because we simply don't know at this point in time whether or not President Yoon will be impeached and then subsequently removed from office by the Constitutional Court. This really remains to be seen. And then at this moment, it's unknown whether or not his successor would also want to pursue the close security relationship with Japan as well as the United States, because certainly President Yoon's predecessor, President Moon, he was not in favor of a closer relationship with Japan, and he pursued détente with North Korea's Kim Jong-un. So it really remains to be seen how this process plays out with impeachment and then who the successor president might be.
A real different situation unfolding in South Korea, and we will be in close touch. Thank you so much, Ross, for joining us on this detailed and very important stuff that is happening in South Korea. Thank you.
Thank you.
Now we're going